Our next speaker is Andy Podgurski. He's a professor of computer science here at Case Western Reserve University. He received all of his degrees from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I'm not sure whether this is a qualification or the opposite, but he's also married to me. And we've written together a lot about health information technology and really all of the issues that we're discussing today. So I had a lot I could have assigned him, but he's going to address biomedical data quality.
I think my talk and Nancy's talk to follow will alleviate you of any awe you had about big data, or it should. One of the oldest expressions in computer science or computing generally is the idea of garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage in a data processing system, you will assuredly get garbage out. And that remains true, and it remains true of big data. And it's important when you're interpreting research results that are claimed to be derived from big data that you bear in mind that and the issues that I'm going to talk about today. So one of the motivations for things like electronic health record systems was that they would help mitigate some well-recognized problems with paper medical data, like doctors' handwritings. We have some doctors in the audience, and I haven't checked their handwriting, but we all know it's notoriously bad. And so it would be a good thing, it is a good thing to get them to use electronic health record systems just for that reason. Obviously, those kinds of systems can facilitate finding needed information very rapidly because of their electronic search facility. So there's no question that these kinds of systems mitigate some long-standing sources of error with biomedical data. However, numerous sources of error still remain, including measurement errors, measurement from medical devices, blood pressure monitors, laboratory devices, all kinds of devices, data entry error, which is typically a human error, data integration errors, integrating data from multiple sources, analytic errors, doing the analysis that's required in research, software errors, software bugs, and malicious tampering with the data. So I'll talk about each of these issues in a little bit of detail. So first, let me talk about what I call the Oracle problem. This is actually a problem that's well recognized in software engineering, in particular in software testing. When you're testing software, somebody's got to decide when and if the software does the right thing. And that someone is usually a person, not another piece of software. And that problem actually exists with big data too, and you have to bear this in mind. It's sort of a hidden cost with big data. Who does the checking? Who checks the data? And how do they check it? It's big after all. So one of the problems is that automatic processing of biomedical data can actually worsen some data quality problems. So it clearly improves or reduces some data quality problems. It can actually make others worse. For example, software errors can propagate erroneous data throughout an entire database. It can affect potentially every record in the database. Or the analysis can confuse the results of analyzing an entire database. So in some ways, software can actually make the problems worse. Data quality checking requires manual effort, substantial manual effort. We've heard about chart reviews today. That's a classic example of the kind of effort I'm talking about. That's very time-consuming and very expensive. Just the volume of big data precludes exhaustive chart review. You can't review 1 million records to make sure they're right before you do a big data study. In some cases, you can use automated checks. You can use the computer to help you check the validity of data. But the opportunities to do that are fairly limited because you can only check for problems that are well-defined and that you understand well. You can't check for problems you don't know are there. So an example of what you could check is data values out of range. So if you get a height of greater than 200 feet, you can be pretty sure that there's no patient who's actually that tall. But lots of other problems are not checkable automatically. It takes someone with knowledge and judgment to decide. I hate that. How does that happen? I didn't do that. Jeez. An evil spirit. Oh, I borrowed my wife's slides. Okay, so probably the first example of the kinds of errors that can happen with these systems are simple data entry errors. Mistyping numbers, selecting the wrong menu items in an EHR system, checking the wrong boxes, typing the right data into the wrong fields, or into the wrong patient's record. That can happen too. A really interesting example has to do with electronic medical notes, the free text part of a medical record. And many people copy the text from a previous visit with the patient, put it in a new place, and ideally they edit it to make sure it's still correct. Often they get that wrong. They copy it, but it's out of date, and it's entered in the record in a new time, and it's not appropriate to that time. This is actually a serious problem that's been written about in a number of papers. Another source of errors that relate to data entry has to do with poor user interface of these designs. Max just handed me an article in the American Medical News entitled "Familiarity Breeds Contempt with EHRs." And it said that user satisfaction with EHRs has declined by 12% in the last 2 years. And that probably has something to do with high-tech going into effect and a lot more people using these systems. And there being a lot of vendors out there, not all of good quality or selling good quality products. But poor user interface design of these systems can confuse users and exacerbate these problems that I've already mentioned. And some studies have found substantial error rates in the data stored in electronic health records. Other data that's part of big data biomedical studies includes genomic data, proteomic data, metabolomic data. I'm proud that I could say all three of those without too much stumbling. This kind of data needs to be annotated with biological information, with functional information. And there are lots of efforts to do that automatically or semi-automatically. And studies have indicated that the error rates from that annotation can be very high. In one study, up to 60% in one set of proteomics databases. Data integration is a huge problem, particularly when you're dealing with data from a large number of sources. Explorus, for example, who Dr. Jane talked about Explorus this morning, has to integrate data from 120 different hospitals. All of that data is, well, much of it is in different formats with different fields. Some fields are missing from some records, present in others. There's subtle differences in the meaning of fields and so forth. It's a huge problem to integrate data from multiple sources. The same problem arises when you try to integrate data from multiple research centers. And obviously it arises with multiple EHR systems, and it's worse if the EHR systems are from different vendors or have been customized in very different ways. So it's well known in computer science and IT that integrating multiple data sources is a huge source of errors. And one problem is that, and this is especially true of medical data, the quality of data coming from different sources can be different to start with. So one hospital may have relatively good quality EHR data, another hospital may have relatively poor quality data. When you're trying to analyze that data, how do you handle that problem? And I've already mentioned differences in interpretation of fields and so forth. Another issue has to do with data coding. So there are many kinds of medical codes that are used to code the kind of information that's in electronic health record systems. Some well-known codes are ICD-9, ICD-10, the low-ink codes, SNOMED codes, and that's just a few of them. It's been recognized in the literature that coding is often error-prone, inconsistent, and sometimes misleading. Recently, in an AMA document, it was written that one concern today with ICD-9 is the lack of specificity of the information conveyed in the codes. Well, you can see why it's not specific enough. There were only 17,000 codes to work with. So ICD-10, which is supposed to be adopted by 2014, has 155,000 codes. That should solve the problem, right? Well, there's a complexity issue as well. Even worse, there's a problem with incentives. There's an issue called upcoding that's been recognized in the literature, whereby providers have the incentive to code conditions and treatments in such a way as to maximize billing. And so that may be desirable from the standpoint of cash flow, but it's not that desirable from the standpoint of research, because the most specific and most appropriate codes are not being used to describe what's actually happened. And one study suggested that the cost just to Medicare services from upcoding was $2.3 billion a year. I know what you're thinking, that's chicken feed, but you know, for me that's my monthly allowance. And David already mentioned this morning the problems with free text notes. Handling the information that's embedded in free text notes requires natural language processing techniques, which they're moving along, but they're not quite ready for prime time, and certainly not for typical research applications. So this is an example of fragmented data. There's nothing on the slide except the title. Oop. So this problem was mentioned earlier, I think also by David, that clinical data is not collected for research purposes. So it may not meet the requirements of a research study. So when people do a clinical trial, they hopefully work hard to make sure that the data is of adequate quality to support the goals of the study. Since clinical data is not recorded for research purposes, that may not be the case. Outcomes data is particularly problematic because patients are not good at telling their doctors how things turned out in many cases, and vice versa. Doctors don't have the time to chase them down or call them and ask them, you know, did that condition that I treated resolve or not? So the critical outcomes data, which you need, for example, for comparative effectiveness studies for treatments, is very often missing from the record. And the lack of interoperability between existing EMR systems obviously hinders the assembly of complete medical records. If your record is scattered across the systems of different hospitals and some of it's on paper, then it's obviously going to be difficult or impossible to assemble that to get a complete longitudinal record if that's what the study requires. One of my specialties is software bugs, or how to detect them, how to assess software reliability, safety, and security. So I'm well aware that software itself is a major source of error in not only electronic health record systems, but many other kinds of systems. EMR systems are very complex, and similarly the software that's used for data integration that I mentioned earlier is also complex. And almost inevitably, complex software has at least some defects, bugs, that are latent in the software. One problem is that the quality of electronic medical record software is not regulated by the government in the way the FDA regulates devices, for example. So there's no approval regime, for example, for this kind of software, and we've argued previously that there should be one. Potentially, the Office of the National Coordinator's work on meaningful use will lead to such, at least guidance, if not regulations, related to safety and quality of data. But so far, it's not there yet, although they've begun some investigations into the topic. The bottom line is incorrect data resulting from software errors can seriously distort the results of research and make them incorrect. And all you have to do is read the newspaper to realize the many security threats that are out there. And those threats apply not only to financial data and personal data, they apply also to medical data. And if you forget about privacy and security for a second, or privacy for a second, or really confidentiality, you might turn your attention to the integrity of the data. There are reasons why various parties might want to tamper with biomedical data, such as electronic health records. Hackers might want to do it for any one of a number of perverse reasons. Unscrupulous providers might want to do it to increase billing. Business associates might want to do it for whatever reasons. Researchers might want to do it to get better research results or more publishable or fundable research results. Even patients may want to do it for a variety of reasons, such as eliminating things from their record that they don't like. Obviously, these systems are built to minimize the risk of tampering, but the hackers out there are pretty clever, and in fact, it's an industry. It seems to be the major industry from large parts of Eastern Europe and elsewhere, and they're very clever, they're very good, and basically, it's very difficult to stop them. Errors of the kind I'm talking about can seriously bias research data in a way that's hard to control for or adjust for. If the errors in the data were truly random, like the result of typos, then it wouldn't be so big a problem. Truly random errors are easier to handle. You can just use standard statistical techniques, really, to account for the uncertainty in the data. It will obviously increase the uncertainty to some extent, but it hopefully will not bias the results in any major way. But some of the errors that I've talked about are actually systematic errors that lead to systematic biases. So obviously, if software makes every record in the database incorrect in some way, that's going to systematically bias the results. Similarly, upcoding can have a systematic biasing effect on results. Those kinds of biases are difficult or impossible for analysts to compensate for or adjust for unless they understood them completely, which of course you never do. You never fully understand what's happened to the data in a situation like that. So at this point, I should give you some hope. There are some technological remedies. Having true interoperability, if it was, for example, required by the federal government and suitable data standards were promulgated and required, that would help a lot. Improving the quality of the user interfaces of these systems is a doable thing, and that would help. Building these systems with complete and correct data capture in mind would help. These systems, for the most part, are not built to facilitate the future research uses of data. There are things that could be done technologically to help with that. And finally, improving the software validation practices that are used by vendors and providers who implement their own systems would also help. And then there are some non-technical remedies. Oops. Data can be audited manually on the basis of random sampling. So you say sample randomly a sample of records and do, to the extent possible, manual review of the fields of the records to see if they're correct. Then the results can be statistically analyzed, again, to characterize the quality of the data and give some sense of the uncertainty. The government, state and local governments, and the federal government, as well as professional organizations, can promulgate research guidelines that will help ensure data quality. And finally, patient feedback on their own records through personal health record mechanisms is one way of improving data quality, because patients have a strong interest in the accuracy of their own records, at least in some cases, and that can be exploited using them essentially as a crowdsourcing way of validating the data. So in conclusion, there are a lot of threats to the quality of biomedical data, which can seriously distort research outcomes. And mitigating the threats requires, first of all, recognizing them and focusing on them, But it requires, most importantly, substantial human effort, which is costly. So big data makes it sound like everything can be automated and research can be done on the cheap. That's true to some extent, but to ensure the quality of biomedical research data, real human effort and time has to be spent, and it's not trivial, it is costly. Thank you very much. Any questions?
What I think is exciting about this paper is that we have had electronic data for quite a while, especially the researchers. So even when hospitals and caretakers weren't putting their data into electronic sources, we, the researchers, if we got access, had to put them into electronic resources. So in some ways, these questions have existed as long as research has been going on. But now, I think what's great is that because there's a federal mandate to put all of the resources into an electronic form, we're going to focus on these sort of problems. Or do you see it differently? Is there some sort of new problem that you think is emerging because of the federal mandate?
Well, a new problem. In principle, the problems are the same as 20 years ago. Yes, at least since Excel was invented, if not earlier. The volume is going to be different. There's going to be huge volume of data. The variability in the quality is going to be much greater because you've got people who only went into it, went into EHR systems because of the financial incentives that the government was providing. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the Cleveland Clinic and other high-resourced organizations that have been doing it for a long time and hopefully are doing it right. So the scale of the problem is much greater. I think also there's a lot of naivete about these issues. For example, I won't challenge David to tell us, but I suspect in many hospitals that have EHR systems, the physicians and the other clinicians have never been educated about how to respond when they observe what they think is a software failure of some kind. So what would you do if you were using the EHR system, you're busy, you've got 10 patients this afternoon, and something appears on the screen which you didn't expect and you think it's a bug? Well, if you don't report it and you don't report it accurately, that bug's going to go unnoticed, and depending on what it is, it could end up causing harm to a patient at a later time. Obviously, it could mess up research results later. I think most physicians, most clinicians have never been talked to about how to handle that situation by anybody. So that's one small example of a deficiency in the practices or procedures that are used at many health installations.
I'm interested in whether a company like Epic would provide the metadata for their EMR to assist in identifying errors that you've identified in your talk.
Provide it to whom?
Well, to researchers, for example.
They haven't provided it to me.
What I've found is that, and I do medical malpractice work, and a lot of times I'd like to see the metadata behind the records for a lot of different reasons, and I'm told it's proprietary.
You mean like this database schema?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think like all IT companies hold that sort of thing very close to the vest, and it's very difficult for academic researchers to get a hold of it. And if you do, you have to sign non-disclosure agreements that ensure that you don't embarrass them. So that is not. I wish there were more companies willing to do that. I think that hospitals have an incentive that companies like Epic don't have to participate in things like that, because they will suffer if patients are harmed as a result of software errors. They may get sued, for example. Their reputation may be harmed and so forth. So hopefully hospitals will have an incentive, but there's a funny thing about the way these systems work. the systems are not complete when they're shipped to you in most cases. The provider has to do substantial additional implementation to get it ready for use in their environment. And that creates a sort of a conflict in who's responsible should errors arise. Of course, the hospital is going to turn and say, to the vendor and say, this is your fault. And the vendor is going to turn around and say, no, 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 this is your faulty implementation. We handed you a clean product. That's a real problem. Hopefully that will change over time. Hopefully hospitals will be willing to accept more of what's delivered out of the box from the vendor, and then more responsibility will fall on the vendor. But probably the hospital's responsibility can't be completely eliminated.
So, in your opinion, will market forces, and by that I include both the markets for primary and secondary uses, and I include the liability exposure, which for the moment I'm considering a market force, are those sufficient to propel these necessary audits and checks and so on, or do you think that government mandated mandates will be necessary?
What's the market force? Only kidding. I mean, we've argued previously that the answer is no. That market forces are unlikely to ensure, for example, interoperability. There are a lot of disincentives for EHR vendors to make EHR data interoperable. Financial incentives. There are incentives for, we've heard this morning, for companies that aggregate data to make it easily available to people who don't want to pay for it or don't want to pay them for it. So and similarly, there aren't a lot of market forces that would make EHR vendors worry too much about quality, except the possibility of a lawsuit. But it's so easy to blame it on the hospital and their implementation that, and also some of the contracts that they sign with vendors have non-disclosure agreements and hold harmless clauses and so forth to protect them. So I don't think the market forces will suffice. We've argued that there needs to be federal regulation, just like there is with FDA regulation of devices, although it would be a different kind of regime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not yours.
Good job.
There it is. Okay. Okay, next we have Nancy Stout, who is a nationally renowned tax and tax policy scholar. But don't worry, she's not talking about tax today. She joined the University of Southern California Gould School of Law faculty in the summer of 2011. She is the inaugural holder of the Edward G. Lewis Chair in Law and Public Policy. In August of 2012, Professor Stout was appointed academic director of the newly established Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. She has published extensively, mostly on tax, I think, but also some work on causal inference, which is how we identified her. And she has degrees from Ohio State University, the University of Minnesota Law School, and a PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago. She previously taught at Northwestern, Washington University School of Law, and the University of Buffalo. She'll be talking about the challenges of causal inference.
Thank you very much, Sharona, and I want to thank you for putting together such a wonderful conference. This has been great. I really appreciated all the dialogue and the conversations. And I also noted that, every time Andy is kind of stepping away, you would point this way, and so you could do the same to me if things aren't working as they're supposed to.
Even though there's no marital privilege.
So my empirical focus has been in the tax context over the course of the last decade or so, but I've been caring a lot about the question of causal inference, which is a question that we're all interested in. And recently, because of the ACA and the Supreme Court decision, and the fact that this decision revolved all around tax, I've gotten involved in a lot more health circles. So I can talk a little bit about a big project that I'm doing with a team of health policy analysts at USC at the end of the project, if we have time and you're interested in hearing about it. Of course, the central problem in empirical health studies is the question of how to make inferences about the causal effect of treatments. So do unsanitary water conditions cause cholera outbreaks? Does smoking cause cancer? Does smoking cigarettes cause individuals to die earlier than smoking cigars? Today, what I want to focus on is the goal of making causal inferences from the data, and then think about causal inference from a disciplinary perspective. Think about the important features that underlie causal inference. And one reason that I was happy to come today and talk about this is often in my own studies, I think about causal inference and I want to make causal claims, but I rarely go back to the fundamentals to assure that I'm actually making the right assumptions that could lead to reasonableness when it comes to causal inferences. So this is going back to the fundamentals and think about what's underlying our claims. And then I'll talk a little bit about research design that enable us to make causal inferences. And then maybe in the Q&A, I can talk about the theory underlying causal inference and some of the best practices that my co-author, Tyler Vanderwill, and I have investigated. And then note how causal inference and the legal field actually are quite related in quite a few ways, and then my own project on the ACA. It's useful to begin thinking about our goal of causal inference as a goal that's trying to distinguish between association and causation. Two variables are associated if information about one tells you about information from the other. Two variables are causally related if intervening on one actually affects the other. So the two variables aren't simply simultaneously occurring, but one is actually impacting the other or bringing it to life altogether. The field of causal inference is attempting to help us articulate the assumptions that are needed to distinguish between mere association and causal inference. So think about an existing study. Researchers who were studying death rates found that the best indicator of an early death is GDP. So is the size of a country's gross domestic product the cause of early or late death? Or is this mere association? So in order to think about these issues, I first want to point out that of course we know association does not imply causation. Quite a few researchers point this out when they're undertaking empirical studies. And yet they go on to talk about their studies as if they've achieved the requisite, as if they've achieved and satisfied the requisite assumptions that would allow them to interpret their data causally. In fact, often this isn't even the case. So one of my goals today is to talk about the discipline of causal inference to remind us what it is that we're actually assuming in order to reach causal claims and to make them convincing to our audience. So to think about this, consider a study that is attempting to compare death rates among smoking males where we're trying to figure out which is worse, cigarette smoking or cigar smoking. And this is a study that comes out of a 2008 article published by Donald Rubin, who many of you may have heard of. He's one of the primary thinkers when it comes to causal inference. So the researchers go out and collect 350 cigarette smokers, and they find that 47% of the individuals die during the study. They look at 350 cigar smokers and find that 54% die during the study. So cigars seem worse. The question is, can we say there's a causal relationship? Cigars lead to earlier deaths. Cigars cause earlier deaths than smoking cigarettes. Could we generalize this finding? If you smoke cigars, you're likely to die earlier than if you smoked cigarettes. What if I told you that, in fact, there was some background knowledge that I had that older men tend to smoke cigars? So as it turns out, when we look at the data disaggregated by age, we find exactly the opposite result. It turns out cigarettes cause or are associated with an early death among older male smokers. And when you look to younger male smokers, cigarettes are more likely to cause an early death. So now we're seeing precisely the opposite results. And the question is, do these stratified proportions reflect a causal relationship? Or did the last table that I showed you reflect the causal relationship? How do we know? So that's the question that we ask in the context of causal inference, and we need the discipline of causal inference to answer this question for us. So the most important feature or concept in the context of causal inference is, of course, the counterfactual. And the idea of a counterfactual is this. What would have happened if we administered the treatment differently? What if we had given our first individual cigarettes instead of cigars? Or what if we had our cigar smokers treat cigarettes? What if we had given treatment A to an individual and not treatment B? Or if we had given B and not A? So what would have happened if we had done something differently? And we can think about this in the context of real data. So we could say that Y sub 1 tells us what happens if the individual smokes cigarettes, Y sub 0 if the individual smoked cigars, and we would observe Y sub 1 for the cigarette smokers, Y sub 0 for the cigar smokers. And so we can look at the underlying data as too, but before we get there, the thing about the counterfactual is we always have two counterfactuals for all individuals. So what would this mean? It would mean if we really could achieve the truth, we would have to be something like a superhero. We would first go out and collect a random group of individuals and then assign these individuals to smoke cigarettes and observe how they respond. And then we'd literally go back in time, because we're superheroes, and we'd ask these same individuals, we'd assign these same individuals to smoke cigars. And in that way, we could observe what the death rates are among these groups that are highly comparable. We'd see the same individual smoking cigars, the same individual at the same time in their life smoking cigarettes. If we see a difference, then we can say there's a causal relationship, and if we don't see a difference, then we could say neither is worse or better for your health. So let's look at what the data would look like. Each individual in our superhero study has two counterfactuals. And that's key for understanding causal inference. And some of these individuals, like number 1, we'd observe that they would only die if they smoked cigarettes, but not cigars. Or number 2, there would be some individuals who would die only if they smoked cigars. Number 3, we would see this sort of individual in our data set who might die in both circumstances. Or number 4, we would see that the individual didn't die. There's a big problem here, though, but before I get to that problem, we could look to the underlying data that we've generated with our superhuman powers where we reverse time, and we could just simply sum up what happened in this world, our fictionalized world. So for the cigarette smokers, 5 out of 8 died. For the cigar smokers, 4 out of 8 died. And we would then conclude that actually cigarette smoking was worse than cigar smoking. So we could make a causal claim. But here's the problem. The problem is in practice, we don't get to see one individual with two counterfactual. Either you're a cigarette smoker or you're a cigar smoker, and that's all we get to observe. And so in practice, we have one counterfactual for each individual. And then what we would do is we would observe who died early and who did not die, and we could sum up these numbers just like we did. Here we have 4 smokers of cigarettes, 4 cigar smokers, and we find 2 out of 4 cigarette smokers died, 3 out of 4 cigar smokers died, and we have different results. Now we find cigars are worst. So this is the problem. The problem is we want to create a study where we have 2 counterfactuals for every individual in the world. We can't do it. We have a problem because when we see this, we could come to the wrong conclusions. But we still can do some causal inference. And the way we can do the causal inference is to account for what's going on to similarly situated groups. So we would like it to be the case that those who smoke cigarettes and those who smoke cigars are comparable, but I've already told you there's an age difference, and what we know is that if there's an age difference between smokers and that age difference causes them to smoke something different, we also know that age difference also has a likelihood that one group will die earlier than the other. Older individuals, on average, die earlier in fewer years than younger individuals. So what should we do? Well, one thing that we can do is that we can look back to our strata, the older males and the younger males, and compare these individuals. And we can make conclusions or reach conclusions based on this sort of study where we disaggregate the data based on the relevant characteristics. So in this context, we would say for older male individuals, cigarettes are worse than cigars. You're 12% more likely to die earlier if you smoke cigarettes. And we could look to the younger male individuals and say, same thing. If you're a younger male individual, well, cigarettes are worse, but by 15%, you're 15% more likely to die earlier. So now we're looking inside the strata and we say, well, we see now that maybe we can make some causal claims. But the question is, how do we know? How do we know we have it right here versus my very first table where I reached exactly the opposite conclusion? So that's the big question of causal inference. So we have to worry about confounding. Confounding is the second important issue that we have to think about. Counterfactual is the first. That's our gold standard. We know we can't have two counterfactuals for one individual, so now in the real world we have to start worrying about confounding. Confounding occurs when a variable affects both the treatment and the outcome. And I've already told you that the choice to smoke cigars is based on age. We're thinking about longevity as the outcome, and age also affects outcome. In practice, we could think about a lot of other variables that could affect this sort of study. We might think about education. A lot of studies have suggested that more highly educated individuals tend to smoke less or smoke differently. Socioeconomic status, occupational status, so on and so forth. So what we would do is we would think about these other variables and try to include them into our study. Sometimes we might not know if another variable is a true confounder, but we would also control for these as well. So in practice, we control for all the variables that we think might confound our study. So what are some of the research designs that enable us to get beyond the problem of the counterfactual and address the problem of confounding? Of course, the gold standard is the randomized controlled trial. So with randomized trials, who gets the treatment is determined randomly. And that means we collect a bunch of individuals, and I assign you to smoke cigarettes and you to smoke cigars, and we see what happens, and in that way we can make causal claims. We know that in expectation there's nothing about these two groups that'll be different based on age or socioeconomic factors or other factors if I've randomly collected the individuals and randomly assigned the treatment. There's a big problem though, and this came up in some of the other talks that we've had today. One problem is time. If we're doing a randomized study, a randomized experiment or a randomized controlled trial, we have time delays. I'm going to sit around and wait to see what the health effects are for you guys and the health effects are for you guys, and I don't really want to wait for 25 years to see if you're going to die earlier than expected. So there's time delays problems. Also there's ethical problems. Is it really ethical for me to assign you to smoke these different items? If individuals do agree to be assigned, and this is what Barbara Evans pointed out, there's the consent bias. Who would agree to be assigned to smoke cigarettes and cigars? Very atypical individuals. It'll lead to problems of generalization down the road. What if in my trial some people stop smoking? What if in my trial people smoke cigarettes and marijuana? How am I going to disaggregate that? What if individuals leave? There's a lot of problems associated with these randomized controlled trials, so we need something else. Some of the other methods that we use are associated with observational studies. We've talked a lot about observational data. This is empirical comparisons between treated and controlled groups where it's not possible to randomly assign the treatment or randomly collect the data. And we know in this context we have to control for our potential confounders. We're never sure what our confounders are, so quite a few times people control for more than we need to. But in general, we know randomized trials are the best, but we can't often satisfy the requirements associated with randomized trials. And what we're going to try to do is satisfy the assumptions that the randomized trials satisfied in another context. So one approach is matching methods. This is an approach that I personally really like. In this context, we collect or we have observational data, so we've gotten past the privacy concerns, we've gotten past the problems that Andy's pointing it out. We now have a large collection of data, and one way to get past the confounding problem is we match our individuals, cigar smokers and cigarette smokers, based on all the relevant characteristics, on age, on education, on socioeconomic status. There's quite a few different approaches that you can use to match individuals, but the point is, match the individuals so there are no differences. There is no confounding, and in this way the method replicates the randomized trial. So we have two similarly situated groups, not one that's older than the other, not one that's more educated than the other, not one that's wealthier than the other, two similarly situated groups. There's no confounding, and we can make causal claims. Of course, regression is a widely understood method for achieving causal claims. And regression, if we have treatment A, cigarettes versus cigars, we have a confounder C, we need to make sure that confounder is in our model. If we have that confounder in our model, then we could say we have a causal model, and we would say that intervening to increase the smoking of cigarettes would increase the likelihood of deaths by the coefficient on C, B sub 1A. If we don't have all the confounding variables in the model, then we know that all we have is a model that tells us about association. And that's the big key here. A lot of people say that I'm not sure if I have the confounders in my model. If you don't have the confounders in the model, or you can't convince your readers that you have the confounders in your model, there's no causal claims that could possibly be appropriate. All that we could say is, like GDP, there seems to be an association with early death. It doesn't necessarily cause early death. And so that's key. I think I'll stop here, and if people want to talk about ideas that some of my co-authors and I have for achieving success in this context, we can talk about that, or relationships between the field of causal inference and law, or my study on the ACA. I can take questions on those topics as well.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very nice talk. So can you imagine explaining to a judge and a jury in a case, legal case involving tobacco use or some other substance that might be harmful, where the claim was that it was harmful and somebody should pay somebody for damages due to that? Can you imagine explaining confounding, counterfactuals, and causal graphs, and what do you think would happen in a courtroom if you did that?
Well, there's actually, I mean, I haven't given expert testimony in these sorts of cases, but I have quite a few friends that have, and literally they do go back and talk about these criteria in order to get the judge and the jury to understand the basic problem. And the reason for that is often what the expert witness is trying to do is to convince the judge or the jury that there's a confounder that's left out of the model. And if you can convince the judge or the jury that there's a confounder left out of model, there's no causal claim that the cigarette actually caused the early death. It could be any one of another things. It could be just that this was an older person, or this person had a pre-existing medical condition, or so on and so forth. So actually, this sort of kind of preliminary introduction to the topic occurs inside courtrooms.
Isn't that really easy to do? Isn't it easy to convince naive listeners that, oh, there must be a confounder, a genetic factor? You can choose from all possible variables, right, and try to convince people that that's a confounding. I believe the smoking companies actually did argue years ago that a genetic factor might cause you both to smoke and get cancer.
Yeah, so I'm just pausing about this because there's a large literature out there that raises the question of how do we know that we have a confounder or not? And there's no scientific answer to that. It's all based on background experience, expertise, and shoe leather work. And in fact, I really liked David Kalber's talk where you were thinking about undiagnosed hypertension among heavy children who had weight problems. Now, I would have no idea that these could be correlated. So it took someone with background knowledge and expertise to even understand that there was something related. And so there's a lot of individuals who who spend a lot of time writing, saying that you can set up these models, throw in tons of variables, but you never really know if you've achieved your goal of including confounders unless you have a terrific amount of expertise and knowledge, which requires case studies and hard shoe leather work and some sort of professional experience to really know. So in some ways, I think that's the answer. I think the person who can win the debate about confounders is the person who can give the best story that there is some sort of confounding going on. And what we know is the person who can give the best story about confounding is the one with the background experience and the professional understanding of the problem. And so I literally wrote down David Kalber's experience precisely to point out in a paper sometime that this isn't a correlation or even some sort of causal mechanism that most of us would have ever thought of. Instead, you have to do the hard work of understanding the data and working towards understanding the relationships before you'll be convincing on the problem of confounding. Do you want me to just call on people?
Oh, they're supposed to come to the microphone because it's being webcast.
The microphone can come to them.
Yeah, the microphone will come to you.
The microphone will come to them.
Oh no, I didn't know it would be videotaped. So, if no person, or very few people without a degree in or an understanding of statistics, algorithms, calculus, and higher math, come to a jury or sit behind a bench, the individual that propounds the most effective argument is most likely going to be convincing in terms of explaining whether or not the confounder is the cause or not the cause.
So what you're saying is it's easy to pull the wool over juries?
I'm saying whoever's the most effective debater or arguer isn't necessarily pulling the wool because nobody really knows except for the statistician. It appears to me, since it's so highly involved with the science of regression and math and statistics that is alien to most individuals sitting in a jury or behind a bench, that it's probably the easiest way for a bright person to win the debate.
Well, I guess I would say that's probably the case in all expert witness contexts. So you hire expert witnesses, and the jury doesn't know anything about how hospitals operate or cars operate when it comes to these, brakes that aren't working, so on and so forth. So I would say that's the case. And indeed, people have worried about that. Who has the most convincing expert witness in a lot of contexts, but specifically I've seen discussions about this in this context as you're suggesting. And recently, Judge Posner on the Seventh Circuit, he overturned a district court judge who he thought just didn't do the work to help the jury understand, and to help himself understand who was the better expert witness. And so now what circuit courts are saying is the judge has an obligation to get help himself or herself to understand what these studies are about and to help interpret them. So you're right, that is a baseline problem, and now courts are saying judges have a responsibility to do some of the hard work.
Oh, somebody's already made the argument that the propounder can decide whether it was confounded or not by the confounder, and therefore the judge and the jury should be educated so they at least have a little background in making a determination. What was that decision?
This decision came back, I wish I could remember the, literally I think a month ago.
Oh, that's a great decision.
Yeah, it's a really good decision. A lot of statisticians were really happy about it. That he was, first, Judge Posner gets a lot of attention in the judiciary. He's one of the most widely cited and widely admired circuit court judges appointed by Reagan. And, you know, he's basically helping change our culture and saying judges need to do more work to get this right, to avoid this problem.
I get two questions. So I'm going to ask an unfair question, just to help lead into the next talk. So you talked about matching and wanting to get a treatment and a control group that were as similar as possible in every respect except the treatment. So how about this? How about I take the entire health record of the patients from Dr. Kelber's system, and I do whole genome scanning for each individual and get their whole genome, pack those two things together, and include all several 100 million variables in my regression model. Of course, never mind the fact that, you know, never will be able to fit that model. But I basically uniquely identified the individual, right? So how do I do the statistical sampling?
Well, you're including too many variables for one.
Yeah, I know.
So you got to get rid of about 17,550 of those.
It's an unfair question, but it actually gets at a real issue, which is
how far do you go?
The dimensionality of the data, how far you go, and that judgment is involved. And these problems have not been addressed in medical literature and the statistics literature. I mean, people pay lip service to them, but they've certainly not been resolved in any satisfactory way yet. So it's a very, very philosophically and scientifically interesting area.
Yeah, and so this is where, this is why background knowledge is so important. So my co-author and I, did you have a follow-up on that? Was that the preliminary question?
He's not allowed because we're running out.
Okay, he's not allowed. So what my co-author and I have thought a lot about is the uses of graphs to get after this. And there's a lot written on this new graphing approach to understanding the problem of causal inference and the potential of confounding. So if we want to understand how a variable affects outcomes, how our treatment affects outcomes, we can start thinking about this with the help of graphs. And what we know is, from my definition of confounding, is if there's a variable that affects both the choice to choose cigarettes over cigars and the likelihood of an early death, such as age, where we see age is affecting cigarettes, the choice to choose, and age is affecting death, then we know that's a confounder. So these graphs can get very complicated, or they can stay simple, but the point is, if you force yourself to step back and graph the relationship between and among the variables, often you can see there's a lot of variables that simply don't need to be put into the model at all. Or there might be variables that you have in the model that you should actually take out because they might induce confounding. So one thing that I've started to advocate is if we use this graphing approach, we can see whether we need to control for certain variables. We can see how these variables interact in problematic or not problematic ways. And then we can create the most parsimonious models. So one thing that Tyler Vanderwill has written on, and I'm just saying his name because I know you've read his material, he's argued that most statisticians who study health outcomes control for way too many variables. These models are way overspecified. And in fact, probably they're inducing confounding more than getting rid of it. And it would help if we all went back and started graphing the relationship between these variables.
Thank you so much. So, this is Fullerton, I am. Okay. Oops, thank you. All right, last but not least, we have Malia Fullerton, who is an associate professor of bioethics and humanities at the University of Washington in Seattle. She received a doctorate in human population genetics from the University of Oxford and later retrained in ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic research with a fellowship from the NIH National Human Genome Research Institute. Her work explores researcher and participant perspectives on data sharing, secondary use, and result return in the context of contemporary genomic research. And she'll be addressing leveraging EMRs for genetic research.
All right, thank you so much, Sharona. It's been a real pleasure to be invited to participate in this meeting. In a lot of ways, I'm probably the worst person to be giving this talk. I'm going to be talking about some things we have learned from a research study that I have been involved in called the eMERGE study, the eMERGE network. And I'm not going to be able to answer some of the hard scientific questions. I've been working more on the bioethics end, but I'll do my best. And certainly I feel a little chagrined sort of following Nancy's talk. As you'll see in a second, this will be statistically rather unsophisticated, although there's some pretty sophisticated work, I think, behind some of my simplistic representation here. So today, here's my roadmap. I want to spend a little bit of time just explaining why it is that we even have begun to think about the use of electronic medical record data in genomic research, tell you about some of our preliminary findings from this research, describe some of the lessons learned with regard to how best to make use of electronic medical record data in genomic research with some pointers to how we might be thinking about using these data increasingly moving forward in this era of big data that we heard about earlier today. And then talk a little bit about what's on the near horizon, particularly in the context of where we are moving next in terms of the eMERGE network. So to begin with, why EMRs in genomic research? Well, what we are trying to do in a lot of genomic investigation is to associate variations in the genome with clinical outcomes, with health-related outcomes. This is often, until very recently, has often been done in the context of something called a genome-wide association study. It's definitely an association study. It's not a causal inference, although I think some of those slippages in terms of assumptions with regard to causal inference are made in the genomic era, in the genomic domain. Basically what we're doing is we are lining up lots of people called cases who have a disease or health outcome of interest and comparing them to lots of controls, mostly very carefully matched with regard to their characteristics, and comparing basically the underlying genetics of those cases and controls. We do this kind of comparison across many hundreds of thousands of different genetic locations in the genome, sometimes known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, and where there is a statistically significant association. We can see this sort of dots occurring high up in the graph. This is a so-called Manhattan plot, so that where SNPs in a particular region of the genome are closely associated with case status, we then have the ability to map variations in particular genes to their increasing susceptibility for particular health states. That's the underlying reason or rationale for why we want to do this sort of work. We want to identify genetic susceptibility. The way in which we would most commonly do this in looking at the effects jointly of genes and environmental exposures would be to recruit people into a very large prospective study. One such national prospective cohort investigation was proposed by then Director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, Francis Collins, in 2004. This turned out to be a prohibitively expensive undertaking. There was lots of public comment on this, and basically we decided that it would be too hard, too expensive, too labor intensive to basically recruit in from the beginning to a large research cohort, 500,000 people, such as has been done in some other national biobanks. So, In the intervening period, we've been trying to figure out how to do equivalent kinds of research without starting de novo, without starting from scratch. And this is where the interest in electronic medical records comes in. So about 6 years ago, the NHGRI, the National Human Genome Research Institute, put out a request for applications for a research network which would involve proof of principle research, trying to associate genetic variations with phenotypic sort of health outcome expression data that had been derived from electronic medical record data. In the initial round of funding, the first 4 years, 5 health systems were involved: Group Health in Seattle, with which I have been affiliated, Marshfield Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Vanderbilt University, as well as, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the 5th one, because Geisinger came in later, Marshfield, Mayo, and Northwestern University, sorry, in Chicago. So the red stars. And then we have now since expanded the network on the latest round of funding, and we've basically been trying to kind of do this science, some of the science that Sue was talking about in her presentation earlier today. There's Group Health. This is an impossible to read slide. I know this is a data table just from the first 5 sites. Basically, the way this worked is that at each of the 5 health systems, there were individuals who had previously been recruited into a research study, most typically into a biobank, where they gave permission for genetic analyses to be undertaken using DNA extracted from their blood, as well as for researchers to collect information on them and to extract information from their electronic medical records. So this was not going in and doing research with people's medical records that they had not given permission for. All of these people were proactively recruited into a health research study, and then we were coming in secondarily and saying, how can we now try to kind of leverage the fact that these data were available in these kind of individual siloed contexts and start putting things together in terms of the larger network. There's lots of information here which I don't have time to fully review, but basically different sites had different primary phenotypes. We were working on dementia at Group Health, Marshfield on cataracts, for example. Each of the 5 health centers basically had a slightly different electronic medical record system. The ways in which people plan to extract data from their medical records was slightly different, and the patient cohorts were all slightly different. So this was truly a sort of proof of principle kind of exercise. Can we actually get any reasonable science done, even with this very, very diverse set of cohorts? The reason why we wanted to do, or why the NHGRI in particular wanted to do a network project, was because if you went in from an epidemiological basis and tried to basically ask how many people in any one of these individual cohorts had particular traits or health outcomes of interest that you wanted to study, the actual numbers were too small at any one site. But when you put them all together, if you combine the data across the 5 sites, then we were suddenly increasing the overall numbers of people affected by particular health conditions and increasing the statistical power. So that was the underlying rationale. And as I've already indicated, the aim of the research was basically to determine whether we could take data captured through routine clinical care with medical records, use it to identify information about disease phenotypes, and have that be sufficiently robust, notwithstanding all of the things that Andy's already told us, have that work to conduct a genome-wide association study, and in addition to explore relevant ethical, legal, and social and policy issues that might arise. Not only were different medical systems involved, but then the actual data that were present in each of the medical systems varied widely, so that, for example, at Group Health, we had pharmacy data going back to 1977, whereas at Northwestern University, it only began in 2002. There's way too much here for me to tell you about. I provide references. There's lots of papers that have been published now out of this research initiative, and if you're at all interested, I urge you to go and take a look at those. This Newton et al. Just came out earlier this month. Not to leave you in suspense, the take-home message is that basically, as a research exercise, it seems to have worked. Okay, and I am not the scientist who was crunching these numbers. Like I said, I'm in a bioethics department, but there have been at least 3 different types of science that have been enabled as a consequence of making use of these data, and I'll just briefly introduce them to you. The first is that we've been able to take previously reported genetic associations, shown here as red squares, odds ratios being an indication of the degree to which a particular genetic marker is associated with a particular disease or trait. The first on the list is rheumatoid arthritis. We've been able to take those associations and, using data solely taken from the electronic medical record, replicate those findings in a large number of cases. And so that's interesting. It hasn't always worked, and generally that has to do with phenotypes which are harder to characterize and where larger sample size were needed, or where genetic effects were smaller. But there's been lots of evidence of replication of previous results. In addition, there have been, and there are an increasingly large number of phenotypes where we have actually been able to generate novel data, novel associations. For example, this paper from my colleague David Crosland et al. It also just came out this month, associating, again from electronic medical record data, a large number, at least 4 different regions in the genome with monocyte count in individuals of European ancestry. And that was an association which had previously been very hard to actually generate from research quality data, was extractable from the medical record, and therefore is providing new insights. And then really it's interesting from the point of view of sort of, the dimensionality of the data and how to think about this. There's also been this really interesting kind of work that has been done, which I barely understand, so I'm just going to tell you about it, which is basically turning GWAS on its head. And when one has a particular region of the genome, a SNP, that has been associated with disease, then asking the question of what other phenotypes, what other medical record data co-associate with that genetic variation. It's a PheWAS. And this is a paper that was published by Denny et al. A couple of years back out of our colleagues at Vanderbilt University, where they were basically able to show that a SNP associated with hypothyroidism, again, an observation that came from the medical record collection, that then when that SNP was associated with all of the ICD-9 codes of all 13,000 people who were involved in the study, and yes, we did do this work, that a large number of related things, thyroiditis and non-toxic nodular goiter and non-toxic multinodular goiter, I know you can't read any of this, also came out as trending in the same direction, suggesting sort of novel associations of disease status that, again, probably would not have been possible unless one was a very talented clinician, for example. I don't know enough about these analyses to defend this, but it certainly was turning things on its head. So, very quickly, scientific lessons learned. That in fact, although we were able to do this, we were able to come up with some novel associations, that actually getting phenotypic information out of the EMR is a complex undertaking. It involves complicated algorithms which need to be internally validated, manually checked, usually with manual chart extraction and things like that, and then taken and applied to a different EMR context, and that itself is very complicated. That every phenotype basically has a different set of rules with regard to that phenotypic extraction, involve different sets of data, including ICD-9 codes, information from medication records, laboratory tests, and that this can vary tremendously across phenotypes. This is just a small snippet of a much larger table from that Newton et al. Paper. And that the performance of these phenotypic extraction algorithms are, as you might expect, variable. That we were able, with varying degrees of fidelity, actually get information with a positive predictive value for specific phenotypes. And a lot of the continuing work of the eMERGE network is figuring out how to do a better job with this, but there are always going to be some inherent limitations, I think, due to the quality of the data that are present in some of the ways that we've already been talking about. That's all I'm really going to say about the scientific lessons learned. There have been a whole bunch of work on bioethical concerns surrounding this work, some of which I was privileged to be very closely involved in, others of which I was more peripherally involved in. There was some pretty major work to do. We've talked about sort of standardization and things like that. There was a lot of work with sharing data within and across the network, and there basically we had data sharing both with people within the network, sharing individual level HIPAA-compliant, limited data set data within the network, jointly coordinated by our Administrative Coordinating Center, and then to conduct some consortium-wide analyses. And then we had the additional problem of the fact that because this work was supported by the NIH, we were placing the data, after we had done our analyses, we were placing a subset of the data into the federally controlled data repository, dbGaP, the database of genotypes and phenotypes. And so there was multiple hard lessons to be learned with regard to how best to, the terms of agreement to share such data, given particularly linking quite complex and granular clinical data with very detailed genotypic data, and then the issue of then fully de-identifying those data and ensuring them in a federal data repository. There, in fact, was differences across different sites with regard to how appropriate it was to share the data, and we had some informed consent differences across groups. At Group Health, we actually had to go back and ask people for permission to share their data in dbGaP. And as part of that study, we were able to generate data, which I think is more commensurate with some of the points that Mark Rothstein was making earlier today, where basically participants were saying that they were happy to have their data shared, but that it was very important or somewhat important that we had asked them. Again, these are not concerns about privacy. These are more concerns about respect from investigators. Risks of re-identification have been thoroughly addressed within the network, and there are lots of basically technical fixes that are underway in order to mitigate the possibility of re-identification from these very granular, dense data. And then we have this interesting problem, which I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about, with return of individual genetic results. And so the fact that we actually might and did, in our case, identify important incidental findings, including evidence of sex chromosomal abnormalities, some of which for which there was no record in the medical record, and we had long conversations about whether those data should be returned to research participants. In the end, no data was returned, but this was an important issue. Decision-making was complex and complicated, and of course would have been impossible if these data had been completely de-identified. On the near horizon, we're moving forward phase 2. Now, rather than taking information from the medical record and using it to advance genomic research, we're going to take genomic research and put it in the medical record. And that is what we are doing on phase 2. Tickly subject. I know we're talking about non-clinical uses here, so just to say this is a surrounding pharmacogenomic decision making. I know folks here at Cleveland Clinic have been interested in doing this in the context of their EHR. Just to clarify, though, this is not about prompting for genetic testing, but actually placing genomic information into the medical record so that when a doctor chooses to prescribe a medication, that there will be an alert saying, probably not best for your patient. So this is what's on the horizon, and as we generate more and more genomic data, I think that we're going to, there's going to be more opportunities for genomic information to have a role to play in clinical decision support, and probably more opportunities for genetic research as well. So I know I've taken too long, but basically just in summary, reliable phenotypic information has been, to date, as part of the eMERGE network, been shown to be able to be extracted from electronic medical record data, including from diverse vendors and in diverse settings. Our preliminary studies as part of that work suggest that this is a cost-effective method for both for replicating and advancing genomic investigation. So my guess is it is here to stay. We're going to be doing much more of this work in the future. There were and continue to be numerous methodological and ethical hurdles that needed to be overcome, and we've managed to sort of do this in the context of a relatively small research consortia, where the total number of subjects, even now in the larger expanded network, is only approximately 25,000. How we get from 25,000 to the 25 million that we were talking about this morning, that's a larger question, and I'm not totally sure what opportunity costs will be as we scale up. But certainly as genomic medicine accelerates, there are going to be many, many more opportunities for EMR-based research, not least because, as I think we all anticipate, genomic information will be routinely embedded into the medical record as well. Okay, so thank you very much.
I'm really curious if you could talk about the ethical and even legal implications of, finding these really important diseases in people and not telling them. I mean, I ran
Right.
into this in my own work where, you know, people have said, hey, you've identified these hundreds of children with, you know, they have an undiagnosed disease. I mean, that was the whole reason that you know, made this big splash. So what is your obligation? You know, what was my obligation to actually tell these patients or their providers or someone? I mean, we ended up making the same decision as you did, not to share the information, but just, it seems like there are both ethical and potentially legal ramifications, that particularly once, if you know who the patient is.
Right, yeah, and I am not prepared to comment on the legal implications. Not being a lawyer myself, certainly there are ethical implications. What it boiled down to within the eMERGE network is for, I think, 3 of the 5 sites, basically the individuals, as they had been recruited into the research study, were told that no research findings would ever be returned to them. And so the argument that was made was our consent form says we are not going to return anything. And then if you actually sort of go back and take a look at that, then like for other sites like Group Health, which at least I think on its face did not have the same set of consent restrictions, it turned out that all of the people to whom we might have wished to return either were predeceased because we had an older cohort, or there was a couple of other sites, there was prior evidence from the medical record that they actually were aware of their genetic diagnosis, and so there was no kind of obligation to return because we could satisfy ourselves that these individuals knew. That was the case for the sex chromosomal abnormalities. That was not the case for the individuals that we identified as being at high risk for hemochromatosis. And we are still in the process of doing a more thorough chart review with those individuals to kind of come to some decisions. And I think there may ultimately be a reconsent process inviting people, asking them whether they would like to have results back. This was enormously complicated in the context of a research investigation. Of course, norms are also changing now. We're starting to do a lot more return in the context of genetic investigation, and maybe we'll all be a lot more comfortable with this. Although, again, if we de-identify the information, that will not be a possibility. So that's a very potent argument against de-identification.
So given all the problems with electronic health records that Andy talked about, do you know how much manual checking was actually done to determine the reliability of the information?
A fair amount was done. Because I was not directly involved in that work myself, I cannot hand on my heart tell you exactly how much was done. So for example, I don't believe that every single diagnosis was confirmed manually, but certainly there was an extensive amount of validation that happened for each of the phenotypes as the algorithms to extract this information was being generated. That one slide that I showed where there was a much lower positive predictive value for dementia at Group Health, which was our primary phenotype, some of that had to do with the fact that we had dementia is a really hard phenotype, and 2, we had extremely good sort of gold standard research data, so that actually coming to the same conclusion on an individual subject from their medical record data versus what the researchers knew about them, that actually 72% or whatever it was pretty darn good. In most of the other cases where there was a higher positive predictive value, it was more of a sort of internal kind of validation process with reference to the medical record itself as opposed to a secondary research-based investigation. So a lot of work was done. I think for the foreseeable future, a lot of such research and work would be needed in order for you to be confident. Otherwise, we would not have been able to identify as many replications as we had in the first place. Yeah.
I have a related question actually about whether there are other specific lessons as far as phenotypic ascertainment. So I would imagine that at some point you guys compared, for example, the utility of free text crawlers against billing codes and so forth, and which particular methods of ascertainment tended to be the most effective.
Again, I wish I had a more specific answer to that. I do know that there were differences. A number of our sites are very heavily involved in natural language processing and extracting information from free text. Most often in the context of these algorithms to derive the phenotype, they were actually drawing in multiple data sets. So they were using ICD-9 codes as well as laboratory values rather than rather than saying, how good is our positive predictive value using one versus the other. They were basically trying to use as much information together as possible. And one of the ways that helped was at certain sites you kind of overfitted, whereas at other sites where some of those values were missing, you could still at least have an approximation. And that was one of the other things that we ended up amalgamating inferred phenotypes that were based on slightly different subsets of data, as it were. Yeah.
This is a really cool project, and I'm wondering, what do you want to do with the data going forward? Do you want to use this to forecast health outcomes for certain types of individuals?
Yes, I mean, well, it's not easy for me to give a short answer to that question. Yes, in the long run, absolutely. Now, when you do a genome-wide association study, for a whole bunch of reasons, although we are looking at hundreds of thousands of variants, they are all individually quite common, and hence the associations, the effect sizes, are actually quite modest. So any one of these data points actually being able to be used in clinical care is relatively low. But people are interested in risk scores and combining information across multiple genetic markers for common diseases and traits. And in the case of the new study that we're working on, we're specifically looking at less common variations in genes that have been previously associated with drug metabolism. And the expectation there is that that information will be predictive of drug response, and that it can be placed into the medical record and will form the basis for prescribing decisions, clinical decision support moving forward. That's the aim, that's the hope. It's all proof of principle. Not totally clear we're going to get all the way through to actually having any outcomes at the end of this current grant period, but I believe that there's a third phase in the works. So the rumors are.
How does whole genome sequencing affect the project, or how do you anticipate it affecting the project?
Well, it increases that already horrendous dimensionality problem, for sure. I think that one of the ways it's going to immediately complicate things, since I have return of results on the pages, as we move to finer and finer granular genetic analyses, we're going to be increasingly identifying rarer genetic variation, which in a population context is less common, but is more often breaking genes in clinically relevant ways. And so as we move to that level of granularity, our obligations with regard to getting information back to people are going to increase, and it's going to be harder to say, oh gosh, we just sit on our hands, I guess, as it were. By the same token, though, because these variations are individually quite rare, in many cases, and particularly for the next 5 years or so, many of these are going to be one-offs that we've never seen before. And then how do we actually make reasoned decisions in an in silico way about the likely clinical consequences of a variation? We're going to be in this world of variants of uncertain significance, and it's just going to be a nightmare. And there's a number of different projects also funded by the NIH which are actively working on this now, as you're probably aware, both whole exome sequencing and whole genome sequencing through the Clinical Sequencing Exploratory Research Awards, where we're trying to actually do this and follow it and measure outcomes in a controlled way. It's going to make it very hard.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to use genetic information in an EMR.
Mm-hmm.
So for something like, let's say, clopidogrel.
Clopidogrel, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for a drug like that, where there are variations, but it's very dependent on population per se.
Yes.
How do you guys plan to kind of integrate that?
Great question. Don't know yet. This is the next. Clopidogrel is, and you might know better than me. I believe it's a drug that's involved in blood clotting in some way, right?
So, yeah. So there's a variant. I think there are 2 variants, and they're very population specific.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have this particular variant, you have a tendency to bleed out.
Right. And so it would seem like if you had information that someone was susceptible to doing that you would want to have that information so that you could ideally put them on a different drug. right? And that is, in fact, one of the gene-drug combinations that's going to be tested in this new round of eMERGE. The population-specific aspects are a very interesting problem. If you can read really fine print, you might have noticed that the first 5 sites for eMERGE, and it's not up here, included mostly all individuals of European ancestry. Relatively, where we did have some ethnic diversity was in the Vanderbilt sample and the Northwestern sample, where there was sort of like 10% African Americans in those 2 groups. It's a huge problem. The NIH is aware of that problem. On the second round of eMERGE funding, they brought in several different cohorts that had more diverse representation, and they're trying to begin to address that issue. But it's something where we're going to have to be very cautious and very attentive in the near term to those differences of genetic association as they might fall out along different population backgrounds. Thanks.
If you had a guess, is there a match gene or a finite number of genes that aggregate into a match gene?
For clopidogrel? No, sorry.
Make somebody more apt at math.
At math?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Is there a match gene or is there a finite number of genes that an aggregate?
I'm afraid I do not know the answer to that question. Let me just tell you, though, it seems to me that propensity to math is like many other common complex traits. A set of papers just came out in Nature Genetics last week suggesting that even though we've all heard about the 2 breast cancer genes, that probably there's upwards of 1,000 genes that are involved in breast cancer incidence. Obesity, similar, several hundred genes have been identified. So if and when somebody takes the time to study math propensity, I'm sure it's going to involve several hundred to 1,000 genes at a minimum.
Out of the human genome?
Out of 25,000 genes in the genome as a total. Thank you. Sorry, a relevant piece of background. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. Well, we've heard about a whole lot of issues relating to big data and to secondary use of electronic health records. And I think the talks were of such high quality that I don't feel compelled to do that wrap-up that's in the agenda. So we get 10 minutes extra of the weekend. Thanks so much for being here. Travel safely if you're traveling, and have a great weekend.